taken everything from them: comrades, homes, illusions of victory, and now they were prisoners in the hands of an enemy they had been taught to despise. When the ships finally docked and the men were herded into trucks bound for inland America, most expected humiliation, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, they found themselves deposited in camps with wooden barracks, orderly fences, clean bedding, and meals that, while modest, were far better than what many had eaten in the field during the last months of the Reich. But the true shock came not from the food or the barracks. It came when the American officers made an announcement that left the Germans staring in disbelief. Every prisoner would be allowed to write letters home. For men who had been raised on propaganda about the inhumanity of the enemy, this seemed unthinkable. Letters were a luxury reserved for free men, and in Germany, even soldiers at the front often waited months for mail to slip through the chaos of war. The prisoners looked at one another, murmuring in disbelief, some laughing bitterly, convinced it was a cruel joke. Could the Americans really allow captured Germans to reach across the Atlantic and touch their families' lives with words? The thought carried both hope and fear. Hope, because families torn apart by war might finally know that their sons and husbands were alive. Fear, because what if the Americans only used these letters as weapons, twisting them into propaganda, altering the words before sending them onward? The first day in the camp, an American interpreter explained the process. Twice a month, each prisoner would be given sheets of paper and envelopes. The letters would be censored, not to change the meaning, he assured them, but to remove any mention of military details. They would then be passed through the International Red Cross, routed via neutral countries like Switzerland or Sweden, and eventually delivered into the heart of the collapsing Reich. The interpreter's calm tone made the prisoners even more suspicious. Many whispered to each other that no enemy would go through such trouble for men who had fought to kill them. It had to be a trick. Yet the promise lingered in their minds like a spark in the dark. Some thought of wives left behind in bombed-out cities, of mothers who might not even know if their sons were alive, of children who perhaps had never even met their fathers. A few hardened veterans scoffed at the idea, refusing to be duped. But the younger men, the farm boys and students turned soldiers, couldn't hide their yearning. If there was even a small chance that their words might reach home, could they risk staying silent? When the first forms were handed out, the barracks fell into an uneasy hush. Men stared at blank paper as if it were more dangerous than a rifle aimed at them. The act of writing felt surreal. After years of orders barked by officers, of lines memorized from propaganda speeches, here was a chance to speak with their own voices. One man's hand trembled so badly he could hardly hold the pen. Another sat frozen, afraid that any wrong word might bring trouble upon his family. Yet as pens scratched against paper, something stirred in the camp. For the first time since capture, they were no longer faceless soldiers or nameless prisoners. They were fathers, sons, and brothers again, tethered by ink to a life that still waited across an ocean and a war. The guards, standing by with quiet indifference, seemed to confirm the truth. This was not a game. The letters would leave the camp. The prisoners, still doubtful, could not yet believe that their words might truly reach across the Atlantic. But a seed had been planted, and in the weeks to come, it would grow into one of the most unexpected lifelines of their captivity. The following days brought further explanations, delivered with almost bureaucratic precision. An American officer, accompanied by a Red Cross representative, entered the camp and outlined the regulations. Each prisoner was permitted to send 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. The length of each letter could not exceed a single sheet of paper, written on both sides, while postcards had to remain brief. All correspondence had to be in German, clearly legible, and addressed only to immediate family members. No mention of troop movements, no descriptions of camp layout, no political commentary were allowed. Any violation would lead to the letter being crossed out with thick black lines or withheld altogether. The Germans listened in silence, weighing every word. Some prisoners muttered to each other in disbelief. It sounded far too generous, almost absurd. Back home they knew civilians in bomb-shattered Germany were restricted in what they could write. And here, as captives, they were being granted privileges that seemed unimaginable. A few officers tried to caution the men, whispering warnings that every line was part of an American scheme to make them docile. "Don't trust the paper," one sergeant hissed. "It's bait." Others, however, pointed out that the Red Cross stood behind this system, and even the most hardened cynics recognized that the neutral Swiss had long been regarded as reliable guardians of wartime mail. When the first official writing day came, tables were set up in the mess hall. Prisoners lined up, each handed a thin pencil, a sheet of paper stamped with the Red Cross emblem, and an envelope already marked with the return address of the camp. For some, the sight of official stationery was enough to stir an ache in their chests. A few simply stared at the page, afraid to start. Others wrote cautiously, rehearsing phrases in their minds before letting them spill onto the paper. A typical opening ran along the lines of, "I am alive and in good health. I am treated fairly. Do not worry." It was the kind of formula they thought censors expected. Yet beneath these bland words lay torrents of unspoken emotion. The Americans, watching from the side, noted the mix of suspicion and longing. The act of writing was more than a mechanical task. It was an inner battle. One prisoner later recalled that it felt like walking on thin ice, not knowing whether a single word might doom the letter. Many avoided mentioning the war entirely, focusing instead on memories of home, the apple tree in the garden, the family dog, the sound of church bells in their village. Others tried to offer comfort, assuring their parents that captivity, though humiliating, was not cruel. To them, it felt surreal to confess such things when only months earlier they had been fighting to the last bullet in places like Normandy or the Ardennes. Censors reviewed each page swiftly, striking out forbidden words with neat lines. The Germans watched as their sentences disappeared, yet they also saw that most of the text remained intact. This was the first moment when disbelief began to soften. If the Americans intended deception, why let so many details pass? A few days later, prisoners saw bundles of letters collected in sacks, sealed, and driven out of the camp. It was proof that something was indeed happening. Their words were on the move. Whispers spread through the barracks. If the letters reached Germany, it would mean not only survival, but a chance to be remembered as more than nameless captives. Hope began to mingle with suspicion. For the first time since capture, the prisoners felt that their existence might still ripple across the ocean, landing in the fragile hands of those they loved. The first letters written in those stark barracks carried an awkward weight. For men who had spent months or years speaking only the language of orders, strategy, and survival, the shift to private words was staggering. The pencil in their hand seemed foreign, lighter than a rifle, yet it trembled as if burdened with the same gravity. A soldier from Bavaria stared for nearly an hour before he finally scribbled, "Dearest Mother, I am alive." That single phrase released a flood of emotion. He wrote of the food, of the clean bunks, even of the strange kindness of guards who offered cigarettes without demand. But as he filled the page, he wondered if any of it would reach her. Others faced different struggles. One man, captured during the Normandy invasion, wrote to a wife who was expecting their first child. He hesitated over every line, uncertain how to address a life he might never see. "If you have given birth," he wrote haltingly, "know that my heart is with you." Another prisoner, a teacher before the war, tried to compose a letter to his students, only to remember that correspondence was limited to family. He tore the page in frustration, starting again with a note to his aging father. The camp echoed with sighs, scratching pencils, and the occasional muffled sob as men confronted feelings long buried beneath uniforms. Fear lingered over every sentence. What if the censors interpreted something as a hidden code? What if a careless word endangered loved ones in Germany? Many prisoners confined themselves to sterile, almost mechanical reassurances. I am healthy, I have food, do not worry. Yet even stripped of detail, those phrases carried immense weight. In the silence of the barracks, the realization dawned that for families who might have assumed them dead, even the simplest line was life itself. The Americans, accustomed to paperwork, treated the process with routine calm. The letters were stacked, inspected, and packed for delivery. But for the Germans, each folded sheet represented a lifeline stretching across thousands of miles. The very act of writing stirred memories that blurred the walls of the camp. Men spoke quietly of Christmas markets, of riverside walks, of the smell of fresh bread back home. Some grew almost desperate, filling every inch of space with rushed handwriting as though cramming an entire life into a single envelope. Days turned into weeks as the prisoners waited, unsure if their words would ever cross the ocean. Yet even before replies arrived, the act of writing had changed them. The barracks seemed a little less oppressive. Conversations shifted from endless speculation about the war to shared memories of home. Men who once glared at each other in silence now traded stories of mothers, wives, and children. Hope, fragile and uncertain, began to seep into the camp's atmosphere. For the first time since their capture, they realized they were not cut off from the world. Their existence was no longer buried behind barbed wire. Somewhere, far away, someone might soon open an envelope and read their words, learning that they were alive. The fear had not vanished, but it now lived side by side with an unfamiliar emotion: anticipation. Once the letters left the camp, they began a journey that few prisoners fully understood. Bags filled with envelopes were first delivered to military postal centers within the United States, where censors once more reviewed the contents to ensure no hidden codes or military secrets slipped through. Afterward, the bundles were handed to the International Red Cross, whose emblem, even in wartime, carried a kind of sacred neutrality. The prisoners had seen the insignia stamped on their letterheads, but knowing that neutral intermediaries handled their words gave the process an air of legitimacy. Still, the men whispered among themselves, asking whether the mail would actually be allowed to cross into Germany. The logistics were complex. Letters traveled by rail to ports on the East Coast, often New York or Boston, where they were loaded onto ships heading toward Europe. Some traveled across the Atlantic under constant threat from U-boats, though by the later stages of the war, those dangers had diminished. Upon arrival in neutral Switzerland or Sweden, Red Cross officials sorted, bundled, and redirected the mail into the Reich's fragile postal system. Each step took weeks, sometimes months, but gradually the letters crept closer to their destinations. Inside the camps, prisoners pieced together rumors of how this system worked. Some had heard that the mail crossed through Lisbon, others swore it was carried via Geneva. A few skeptics still insisted that the sacks never left American soil and were quietly destroyed, but their certainty began to erode as the weeks passed. Too many details matched accounts from the Red Cross, and the Americans appeared unconcerned, even casual about the process. It did not feel like a propaganda trick. It felt like bureaucracy, relentless and methodical. For the Germans who had lived under a regime obsessed with secrecy and control, the very idea that their words might sail openly across oceans and borders was extraordinary. They tried to imagine the path, their handwriting packed with hundreds of others, riding in mailbags, crossing stormy seas, then passed from hand to hand until finally slipping into the cracked letterbox of a home in Cologne, Dresden, or Munich. The scale of it was overwhelming. Some prisoners began to ask questions of American guards, hoping to glean more information. Occasionally, a sympathetic soldier explained that mail delivery was slow but real. "Be patient," one guard advised in broken German. "The words will find their way." That simple assurance carried enormous weight. For men accustomed to lies and propaganda, hearing even a small confirmation felt like proof. The waiting became its own form of torment. Days dragged on as men stared at the camp gates, half expecting a courier to arrive with replies. To fill the silence, prisoners gathered in groups and speculated about when their families might read their words. They wondered whether their mothers still lived in bombed-out neighborhoods, whether wives had survived raids, whether their letters would bring relief or only deepen pain. Despite the uncertainty, a subtle transformation took hold. The act of sending letters turned captivity into something less absolute. The men were no longer isolated figures behind wire. They were participants in a fragile line of communication, a human bridge stretching across continents in the middle of a brutal war. The knowledge that their words might travel further than they could gave them a sense of movement, of life beyond the fences. In a world defined by limits and commands, that was an astonishing freedom. When the first replies finally trickled back into the camps, disbelief rippled through the barracks like a shock wave. Weeks had passed, sometimes months, since the men had nervously scrawled their first hesitant letters. Many had resigned themselves to silence, assuming their words had been lost at sea or intercepted by enemy hands. Then, one morning, guards entered carrying bundles of envelopes stamped with German postmarks, smudged with the ink of distant towns. Names were called out, and trembling hands reached forward to claim the fragile slips of paper. The reactions were immediate and raw. Some men clutched their letters to their chests, unable to open them for fear of what they might reveal. Others tore them apart instantly, their eyes devouring every line. A soldier from Hamburg collapsed onto his bunk as he read the familiar handwriting of his wife, who described the rubble left by Allied bombing, but assured him she was still alive. Another prisoner, barely 20 years old, learned that his mother had wept for days before receiving his first message, but now rejoiced knowing he had survived. For these men, the words were not just ink, they were proof that life outside the barbed wire still existed. But the letters also carried pain. One man discovered that his father had been killed during an air raid in Berlin. Another learned his home village had been flattened, leaving his family scattered across the countryside. Some read about shortages, hunger, and the growing despair of a nation losing the war. These revelations hit harder than any physical hardship of captivity, yet even grief became a strange form of connection. They were part of their families' struggles again, not cut off in silence. As more replies filtered in, the camp transformed. Conversations no longer revolved solely around rations, chores, or rumors of the front. Instead, men read passages aloud to trusted bunkmates, comparing the handwriting of wives, the cautious optimism of parents, the jokes scribbled by younger siblings. It was as if pieces of Germany had arrived and taken residence in those wooden barracks. For the first time since capture, men laughed together, not at cynical jokes, but at familiar stories from home. The Americans observed this with quiet detachment, occasionally amused at the way hardened soldiers softened when clutching their mail. To them, the system was simply policy, part of the Geneva Convention and international agreements. To the prisoners, it was nothing short of miraculous. That a letter could cross oceans, borders, and the chaos of war to land in their hands felt like an act of mercy in a merciless world. Inevitably, new questions arose. Could their families safely reply without fear of German authorities? Many knew that in the Reich, mail was also censored, and certain phrases could draw suspicion. Yet the fact that replies had arrived at all shattered much of their lingering doubt. Whatever propaganda they had been fed about American cruelty seemed hollow compared to the tangible reality of an envelope carrying a loved one's words. Some began to plan their next letters with more courage, daring to write not only